Hey, what's up, folks? So I just got done with my first round game in the 2021 Vegas Open here in sunny Las Vegas, Nevada. And I'm going to be continuing the tradition of recording post-game recaps of all my games. This is something I started a couple of years ago for a few reasons. Mainly, I wanted to commit myself to going over the game right afterwards and kind of getting my thoughts out so that it's easier to analyze the game in depth later. And number two, to give folks a chance to follow the games and get to hear exactly what I was thinking during the game. So this first round, I was paired against Jeffrey Serna, who is rated 1981 FIDE, but his USCF rating is quite a bit higher. I think he's 2140 or 2180 or so USCF. And of course, in today's day and age, there are no easy games. So I definitely felt like this was going to be a tough round. And I ended up losing my first game in my previous tournament, the 2021 National Open, so I was definitely trying to take this game seriously. And I always struggle with the first round because I never quite know what to play. There was no time whatsoever to prepare or even check my opponent's games, so I was kind of going in totally blind. And I didn't know if he was going to play e4 or d4, and I was kind of thinking about what I would do. Eventually he sat down and he started out with e4. And yeah, I was considering the Sicilian here and e4, e5, and lots of different things. Eventually, I decided on my kind of pet system, the Nimzovich defense, one knight c6, or as it's often called, the horse opening, which I think is a good name for it. And this is one I like to use when I'm kind of coming in unprepared and I just want to get an interesting game early on and not really compare too much notes in terms of opening theory. So there are many different ways for white to develop. Of course, he chose knight c3. I played d6. He goes d4, and now knight f6. And my idea behind this system is that I'm essentially playing perk defense, except I've committed to the early move knight c6. This kind of provokes white in some cases to push d5, where black's idea is often to just draw back to b8 and then kind of chip away against white center with c6 and e6 and so on. So it's a pretty provocative system. I would say this is a very risky one, but I think it gives black really good fighting chances right out of the gate. And so a lot of times the positions can go into a King's Indian kind of structure that I'm quite fond of. So after a little bit of thought, my opponent played f4 here. And this is a very aggressive way for white to play, kind of in the style of the Austrian attack, where white just wants to play like knight f3 and e5. And so I played the move e5 here, which I believe is best. And now again, white has a bunch of different options here, including d5, which makes a lot of sense, as well as knight f3. And white can even play d takes e5 and go for the endgame and try their chances here. He started thinking a little bit and ended up playing f takes e5, d takes e5, and now pushing d5. And here I thought for a little while as well, but I ended up playing knight e7. As far as I'm used to in these positions, the knight is usually going back to e7 when we get this kind of structure, and then transfers over to g6, and then the bishop can come out to d6. And I think it's a pretty solid structure for black. As it turns out, though, in this position, I checked my notes after the game, and I actually could play the move knight to d4. And the difference here is that had white pushed d5 earlier without taking on e5, then I think in this position knight e7 would be the right move, because after knight d4, white can play bishop e3, and I'm not sure the knight on d4 is so stable. But in the game after fe5, de, and d5, now after knight d4, if bishop e3, black can just meet this with bishop c5. So this is the big difference when white includes the capture fe5, de5, which I didn't quite appreciate during the game, that I can actually just play bishop c5, and my knight on d4 is very strong. I'm threatening knight takes c2 check, as well as moves like bishop g4, knight g4. I think black is actually already doing really, really well. So I kind of flubbed the opening a little bit because I ended up playing knight e7, although I think this is a reasonable move as well. And now he played bishop to g5. And here I paused because my first instinct would be to play knight to g6, just kind of continuing the development and defending f6 with the queen. But I realized he might want to play bishop to b5 check, where after bishop d7, white can take on d7. I have to take with the queen here, and then white can take on f6 and spoil the structure. And I wasn't sure how to evaluate a position like this, but honestly, I wasn't too thrilled about it. It felt like my pawns are weak. I possibly have some compensation in view of the dark square bishop being unopposed. But yeah, I really wasn't sure. I was thinking something like queen f3 might happen, and then maybe white castles queenside or plays for like knight e2, knight to g3. And I thought things might go bad here very, very quickly. So I started thinking about other options I could play, and eventually I decided on a6, just stopping bishop to b5 check. And the drawback of this move, of course, it gives white a tempo and also gives white the chance to take on f6 and once again double the pawns, which I was really expecting. Almost 100% sure that my opponent was going to go for this, but he ends up surprising me and plays the move bishop to e2 here, which I think is kind of going in the wrong direction. I thought white should take on f6, and I thought this was very consistent with having played bishop to g5 and weaken the pawns, and I felt like this position was very playable. I had no idea about the objective evaluation, but to me it looked kind of more reasonable for black with the light squared bishops still on the board, as I could kind of fight for the light squares here and then push f5, and I felt like black is getting some reasonable play. So when my opponent played bishop e2, this, definitely really surprised me, because now it allows me to play knight to g6, and I can recapture on f6 without weakening my structure. And now I'm just going to win a tempo soon with h6 and force white's bishop away. In case of bishop takes f6, queen f6, and bishop g4, like trying to trade off the light square bishops, black has queen h4 check. So this is kind of an important detail. So my opponent surprises me again with the move bishop to h5. And yeah, my first reaction to this was that it just didn't look very good. I felt like my knights were very solid, and I couldn't really see this working out for white. Now, of course, the knight on f6 is pinned, so after some thought, I decided to play h6. Could also play like bishop b4 or develop the dark square bishop, but this to me looked pretty direct. And the point is that if white plays bishop takes g6 here, I was more likely than not just going to take on g5. Now the bishop on g6 is still hanging, white has to play bishop f5, and then I can take this one. And I felt like structurally things are looking very good for me. I have this passed e pawn now, I have this advanced g pawn, open h file. Probably I can continue something with like bishop to b4, and to me black's position just looked very, very comfortable. Queen can come to d7, and white has some very clear weaknesses here. So after h6, I wasn't sure what white is going to do. If he takes on f6, then after queen takes f6, I felt like I have the dark square bishop now. I have ideas of queen g5 or queen h4 check, and this looked very, very unpleasant for white. So white ends up just going back bishop to e3. But now this allows me to take on h5 and get the bishop pair. I wasn't sure if this was best. I think black has a number of different options here, but yeah, I really had a hard time figuring out what to do. And since the time control was 90 plus 30, there's no second time control. I didn't want to spend too much time trying to come up with moves here. I really wanted to just pick a direction and go for it. And I decided to just take the bishop and go for the endgame with queen h4 check. Definitely not black's only option here, but to me it felt like it's a comfortable endgame. Black is going to be, I thought, slightly better with the two bishops, and I can just kind of slowly press. Whereas if we don't go for the endgame, then I really wasn't sure what to make of the position. I thought it was pretty sharp and dynamic. Black definitely fine in my opinion, but yeah, I felt like the endgame would just be kind of a straightforward position to play, and I honestly kind of wanted to practice like a playable endgame. I thought it would be a good way to warm up for the tournament. So white trades, goes king f2, and now I play bishop to d6. And my point was that if white were to play g3 here, I was just going to drop back knight to g6, and then castle and prepare the f5 break. And I felt like if I could get f5 in, then I should be doing pretty well. Again, my light square bishop is unopposed, so to me it seemed like a nice position for white, and now white is not getting enough counterplay in time. Instead, white played knight f3, which surprised me a little bit, but it also definitely makes sense. I decided to trade on f3, g takes f3, and the structure has changed a little bit, I think, in white's favor, because he was able to kind of strengthen his center. But on the other hand, I also felt like my play on the king side with g6 f5 here is always going to be coming one day. So I actually thought I'm not doing too badly here. I thought it's like a pretty dynamic position. I felt like white at some point is going to try to get the c-pawn moving, and that should be his main plan. So I really wasn't sure what's going on. It feels like a position with kind of chances for both sides, but I believed in the bishop here, and I ended up playing g6. I also considered castling, the idea of playing f5 and getting the rook on the open f file, but somehow I felt like getting the pawns moving with g6 and f5 was just going to be more effective. Now white ended up playing knight a4. I was calculating some really interesting lines here. I thought rook hg1 might happen because it looks like white is hitting the g6 pawn and stopping black from playing f5. But then I was thinking about maybe just playing f5 anyway, and I was actually trying very hard to make this work. Because the initial point is that if white takes on g6, I go f4, and if white plays bishop to d2, then after king f7, the rook on g6 actually runs short on squares, because if white ever puts any rook on g1, there's going to be bishop c5 check winning the exchange. And if rook g2, then bishop h3, and the rook runs out of squares on the g file, and I think black is winning the exchange here. So I was very excited about this, but then I realized in my calculation that after f4, white could play the very funny move bishop to b6. And on my opponent's time, I was trying to work this out because I wasn't sure if I was 100% going to go for this, because, yeah, it felt like it's on the verge of losing for white, but I had to be very careful here, because if king f7 attacking the rook, then rook g1, and he's threatening rook g7 check, and this looked very, very unclear. And I thought maybe king to d7 was smart to defend the bishop on d6 and threaten taking on b6. And the point here is that white's bishop is actually kind of trapped. It has no more moves on the diagonal, and then if it ever drops back to with bishop a5, then b6 is just winning the bishop. So I thought rook g7 check would happen. I would go king to d8, and then maybe white goes back rook to g6 to keep the attack on the bishop. And then I was looking at some moves like bishop f8 here or bishop to b4. And I was trying to figure out if I can make this work, because it actually did look very, very scary for white to go into this with the bishop possibly trapped. After the game, the engine pointed out that in this position, in case of king d7, white can survive with knight a4. Not just survive, but I think white is actually winning here. Because I can't take on b6, the knight will recapture and win the rook, and white is threatening to play knight c5 check. I've already lost the pawn, and essentially black's position is just collapsing. So yeah, of course, if I don't win the bishop, then my position is busted. Best is to play king to e7, which I also considered, but what I didn't realize, what I missed during the game, is that if white takes here, which I felt like was the only move, otherwise, again, the bishop is hanging, and if check, then king d8, I think black is totally fine. But I was thinking white could take and play d6, and the point is takes, knight to d5 check. I have a hard time keeping the bishop defended, and king d7, knight b6 wins the rook in the corner. So this felt very, very unclear to me. But what I missed was that on d6, I can actually play king f7 here and gain a very important tempo on white's rook. And this one I didn't realize because I also have bishop b6 check coming. So there's no rook g1, bishop b6, and black is just going to be at least up a piece here and totally winning. So yeah, during the game I hadn't really decided if I was going to go for f5 on rook to g1, because I also felt like I can just make a move like king to e7 here and just kind of improve my position, and then f5 might come under better circumstances. But as it happened, my opponent ends up playing knight a4, and I didn't really end up having to make the decision. Though probably I would have played f5. I was really thinking like it was working. A knight a4 is a very critical move as well, though, because white is trying to push c4. And I felt like I had no time to waste, so I pushed f5, and now white played c4. And now I just felt like white really isn't in time, because f4 is coming with tempo. I also have bishop to d7, and yeah, white's just not in time to push c5 here. I ended up starting with bishop to d7. I thought I can actually do a couple of things here. I can either play this one. I also considered the move b5, which I felt was very reasonable as well, because here we're attacking the knight. And if knight c5, the key point is that I have this move f4, and white is just losing on the spot. So this is a key trick whenever white plays knight c5, was we have f4 and hitting the bishop. In the game, I ended up playing bishop to d7, hitting the knight with the same point after knight c5, f4. If white takes on d7, we're taking on e3 with check and winning the knight next. So this is just not working for white. After the game, my opponent suggested instead of c4 to play king e2, which I think makes a lot of sense, because here f4 and f takes e3 no longer comes with tempo, and white can keep the bishop on this much better diagonal with bishop to f2 and follow up with this plan of c4 and so on. I still thought black should be okay here, like I could play something like b6 to stop anything from coming to c5 and then follow up with bishop d7, g5, and I felt like black should have very reasonable play, but yeah, I definitely think this would have been a better way for white to go. Because in the game after c4, bishop d7, now white has a hard time making progress. If c5, I can take on a4, but I can also just play f4 here. And once again, if white takes, then I'm taking on e3 with check, king takes, and I win the piece with bishop takes a4. I wasn't totally sure about how to evaluate this endgame, but I felt like it's only 2 pawns, and so black should have pretty reasonable winning chances. But as it happened, white ends up playing knight c3, which I thought made sense, just going back. And now I push f4, pushing the bishop to kind of a worse square, and g5. I could also start with b5 I was considering, but then I felt like there's no reason to make this move because white can't really prevent it, and I can always play b5 later. So I figured let's just get the kingside pawn storm rolling, and this is kind of my general plan in the position. I want to go h5, g4, bring my rooks to the g file, and one day promote with these pawns. And yeah, the game continued king e2. Now I played b5 because I really want to get this in before white is able to play like a3, b4, and c5. So b5 forces c takes b5, a takes b5. Now I played a3 to stop b4. And yeah, here I felt very much in control of the game because I felt like white doesn't really have a lot of play on the queen side, and I'm definitely in charge on the king side, and I can just push my pawns at will. So here white played knight a2. To me, it made sense to kind of playing for the only plan white has in the position, which is maybe to play bishop b4, rook c1, and hope to create something on the queen side. I decided to just play h5 or g4 immediately here. I also considered h5, bishop b4. I played rook g8, rook g1. And yeah, I thought about playing g3 here, but ultimately I wasn't sure. I thought it might be a little bit too early and that I could be extending the pawns a little bit too quickly here. So I felt like I should just kind of keep building up with h5. Now white plays king f2, still stopping g3. And once again, I need to build up here, so I decided to play rook a f8. And now in rook a c1, white is starting rook takes c7. I'm kind of in time to play king d8. And I felt like this was a nice construction because now I'm ready to lift and double the rooks on the g file, and then one day either play g3 or g takes f3 and kind of take over on the king side. So I felt like this was how I was going to break through. Now white plays rook cf1, so he starts shuffling a little bit and hoping to hold on, but I think ultimately it just doesn't work out. Black's play is too strong. The engine suggests to just take on f3 here, and after king takes f3 to come in with the rook to g4, and I kind of underestimated this one. I didn't quite realize the strength, but black is going to double up here with rook fg8 next. White never wants to take because then black gets just two very, very strong pawns. And if something like h3, then this pawn is always going to be a target in the future. So black could either drop back or consider taking on g1 and taking on h3, and is doing really, really well. Instead, I decided to just build up with rook to g7. And this was, I think, maybe the final critical moment because I really felt like white needed to take this chance to play this move h3, taking advantage of the fact that the rook on g7 is unprotected. And I wasn't sure during the game what I was going to do here because if I play g3, king to g2, this looks very tempting at first, but then it's not exactly clear whether black is going to be able to break through. During the game, I thought, okay, black should be better here. There's definitely chances. I'm going to try to get the rook somehow over to the queen side and try to open up the queen side now that white's king on g2 is kind of tied down to the g-pawn. But objectively, yeah, I really wasn't sure. I can also just keep the tension here. I definitely don't have to play g3. I can play something like rook f to g8, and I felt like black should be better here, but yeah, ultimately my mind just wasn't quite made up what I wanted to do here. As it happens, white ended up blundering with rook to g2. This actually may be a good time to pause the video if you want to quickly spot black to play and win here. I think I noticed it almost immediately. I wasn't considering this move rook g2 during the game. It's definitely understandable white wants to double up, and the point is if black is playing rook fg8, eventually what I wanted to do was just advance with g3, and white is trying to kind of fight against that. But this move unfortunately runs into the immediate g3, where I open up the bishop to go to the h3 square, and essentially black is winning the exchange and breaking through all at the same time, and it's just completely over. So hg, bishop h3, and now white can't really do anything here. If rook h2, then I can even take on g3 with check. If rook f g1, I could take immediately and go rook fg8, or I could just play rook fg8, and yeah, white's rook isn't really going anywhere. And yeah, it was pretty much all over. White tried rook h1, but just bishop takes g2, king takes, rook takes g3. I double on the g file, just trying to infiltrate with rook g2. White played rook h2 to stop this, but now the h pawn just starts coming in, h4. The plan is to play h3, rook g2 check, and eventually I'm going to be taking on b2, and the rook is just way too active. And yeah, white just has no compensation for the exchange here. He ended up taking on d6 and then resigning after this moment because, yeah, h3, rook g2 is coming, and the h-pawn is just going to decide the game. So yeah, I felt like this was a pretty clean way to start the tournament. I was reasonably happy with this game. I did miss a couple of things that the engine points out, but overall I felt like I handled the position pretty well, and I thought I played a pretty reasonable endgame. So it was a good start to the tournament. Tomorrow I'm going to have 2 rounds, starting with the first one at 1 p.m. So yeah, that's going to wrap it up for this video. I'll be trying to record videos at the end of each round and posting them to YouTube as much as I can. If the games run late and I simply run out of time, then yeah, I'm going to reserve the right to wait until after the tournament to complete the analysis. But yeah, I'll try to update folks with my games as much as I can, because unfortunately there are no live games at this tournament, so people aren't able to follow the games live, and we'll just have to wait for the YouTube recaps afterwards. With that, I'm going to wrap it up here. Thanks so much for watching. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, I'd really appreciate it if you did so. And yeah, hopefully I'll see you guys in the next video. Take care.